Thank you all so much for coming, particularly on an intermittently rainy Friday afternoon. We are so excited to be here for the launch of the Budget Lab. My name is Martha Gimbel. I'm an executive director and co-founder with Danny Yagan and Natasha Sarin, our chief economist and president. Our hope is to bring attention to the ways that budget scoring is an incredibly important part of the policy process, bring a new perspective with a focus on innovation and transparency. We're incredibly excited for Danny to get up here shortly and share some of the research that we've been working on. Before I do that, I'm going to briefly embarrass our team by pointing them out, because without them, this would not have been possible. We have Rich Provenzano, our Director of Policy Analysis, Ernie Tedeschi, our Director of Economics, John Rico, our Associate Director of Policy Analysis, Harris Epsteiner, our Associate Director of Economics, Josh Kendall, who's our Research Fellow, Sophia Syed, and who until earlier this afternoon was a student and research assistant at Yale Law School, but Axios informed us that she has been promoted to Associate Professor at Yale, and so we're very excited for her. And then I also want to thank our undergraduate RAs, Jay Philbrick, Larry Gia, Thomas Triedman, and Annabelle Jing, who could not be here with us today, and also Sarah Robinson, who worked with us to get this thing started over the summer and fall. I will also give a shout out to Silva Krober, who's our program coordinator, without whom none of this would be possible. All of you who have messaged me today being like, your website looks so good. Please tell Silva how nice it looks. Again, we're looking forward to the feedback, which, knowing this crew, there will be much of. But we just want to say for now, we are so proud of what we've built and what the team has put together, and we're excited to get started. As I said, Danny is going to run through our results, but before then, we are incredibly excited and honored to have remarks from Shalanda Young, the director of the Office of Management and Budget. She is a member of Joe Biden's cabinet. She made history when she was confirmed with a bipartisan vote in the US Senate, becoming the first Black woman to lead the agency. Historic both as the first Black woman to lead the agency and also with a bipartisan vote, which is becoming less and less common as time goes on. As director, she's secured amazing levels of funding for key national priorities. She was a top negotiator of the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023 that averted a catastrophe debt default and lifted the debt ceiling. She is a native of Southern Louisiana. She moved to DC nearly 2 decades ago to serve as a presidential management fellow at the National Institute of Health. She then spent 14 years on Capitol Hill, culminating as the staff director for the House Appropriations Committee. She holds a master's degree from Tulane University, a Bachelor of Arts degree from Loyola University, New Orleans, and lives with her family, including her young daughter, Charlie, in Washington, D.C. So please join me in welcoming Shalanda Young.
All right. Well, because this is also a Yale event, I have a teenager with me looking at colleges this weekend. My godson, who I can't believe is looking at colleges, is visiting from New Orleans with his mom, my best friend since high school. So, they get to follow me to the wonkiest of things one can talk about. And she goes, "Is this exciting?" I was like, "For us, yes." There are not many rooms in DC where you talk about budget scorekeeping, how excited you are, where everyone else is also just as excited to talk about it. But I want to thank Natasha and Danny and Martha for having me and for doing this. This is a long time overdue, so thank you all for taking on this important work. Ernie, did you take a break at all? Ernie left us and went straight over. And I won't get too far down on calling people out, but we talked about debt limit and negotiations. Michael Linden, also who was is someone who was staff for 14 years and whose boss often thanked them for their work. I just would be remiss to say Michael is the hand you always saw in the pictures when they captured me. because I did nothing during debt ceiling negotiations without Michael Linden. So it's good to see you here, and a lot of friends, and a lot of people I've known a long time. And you're absolutely right, Martha. Everyone will let you know their opinions about what you present today. I'm truly excited to be here because, of course, budget scoring and the question of how to assess fiscal policy is central to what my agency does. It's kind of in the name, the Office of Management and Budget. We're proud of the work we do, and it relies on the expertise of countless people across the federal government. Our scorekeeping efforts are not only part of OMB's statutory role, they are central to as we engage in each year's budget process, making recommendations to the president and ultimately laying out his agenda to Congress and the public, and not written as often yelling at agencies like OAC, like, where's my score? How did you dare come up with this score? What is this? I can't use this. Go look at it again. That is budget scorekeeping as one puts together a president's budget. At the same time, because of how essential it is to the process, we're also mindful of some of the ways in which scorekeeping by OMB and others, our CBO partners, for example, may not always provide a complete picture to policymakers as they wrestle with difficult decisions. After all, that is ultimately one of the primary purposes of scoring. Whether in internal policy discussions or in debates that might play out in the press or on the floors of Congress, scoring is a tool that helps policymakers assess in consistent and standardized ways the trade-offs associated with the change in law. It can help assess the pros and cons of different decisions. It could be used as an excuse not to do something or to do something. To help us understand where we might be going under our current trajectory and to weigh how different choices could affect our trajectory. So it's worth wrestling with places where our current models may not always capture all of the elements that policymakers should care about, especially when translated to the public as a simple 10-year fiscal cost. We have all seen this happen in the headlines during debate over complex transformative policy, where the 10-year score can sometimes serve as a substitute for understanding the fuller pros and cons of a given proposal. Providing better tools for the policymaking process requires first making sure that we are asking the right questions. Let's take an example that is near and dear to my heart: investments in children. When we are considering a new program like those in the president's budget to invest in childcare or early childcare education, it may seem straightforward enough to estimate how much the government is going to spend on a program over the next decade. But when we're thinking about the overall impact on the budget, or perhaps more importantly, our economy and our society, there are other questions we may want to know that scorekeeping may not always capture. We may care about longer-term impacts beyond the 10-year budget window. For example, early childhood education has many immediate benefits for child development, and they also generate long-run benefits, including higher earnings in adulthood that materialize over decades. We may care about the benefits that new investments can spur and that budget scoring is not currently designed to capture. For example, expanding access to childcare increases opportunities and labor force participation of caregivers. I know a lot about that. Which can boost the economy and budget outcomes in turn. We may also care about distribution, recognizing that when we look at programs on either the tax or the spending side, we are mindful of who benefits. We may especially care, for example, whether an investment in early childhood education is going to reach lower income families, where the benefits both for family today and long-term outcomes may be particularly meaningful. In each of these areas, research from economists and other experts can provide data and insights that can help inform how we approach these questions and how we think about the impact new policy might have. These questions are not just relevant to questions around childcare and early education. They're worth asking, for example, when we are considering new investments in climate, especially when it comes to better understanding the cost of inaction and what those might mean for our baseline scenario if we do nothing. And even outside of hot-button policy debates, these questions can be important to ask in the bread and butter of managing the federal government. For example, when we look at the difficulties federal agencies have in securing funding through their appropriations process for large one-time capital investments such as the physical building or IT modernization, those things matter, because guess what? If the score is eaten up by those things, we can't do more in childcare. We can't do more in Head Start. So these rudimentary daily, how do you manage government things, all of those things are impacted by how we do scorekeeping. These are challenging questions, both when it comes to the technical details as we consider how the answers should be incorporated into the policy process. But that's why it's so important for us not only to ask these questions, but develop additional tools to answer them. We work to do that in the federal government, but our work is greatly aided by outside experts. That's why I'm excited to be here today at the launch of the Budget Lab. From personal experience, I know Danny, Natasha, and Martha and the team bring the kind of methodological rigor and thoughtfulness to this process that it deserves, that can help inform how all of us think about trade-offs in public finance, and not just because of the personal experiences that they've had or are anticipating around new investments in human capital. They're having babies. I'm excited about the questions that they're already bringing to the fore, and I look forward to engaging with the new ideas that develop as the Budget Lab gets up and going. And thank you again for welcoming me here today. And I look forward to reading this work, commenting on this work. I won't scream at you like I do OAC and others. Maybe, you never know, but that means I love you and I'm reading it. But thank you for taking this on. It's important work, and we need more people who delve into budget scorekeeping. But given this room and how packed it is, it's also exciting to know people care and understand the importance of this issue. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shalanda. It was such an honor to have you here. I am Danny Yagan. I am co-founder and chief economist of the Budget Lab and a professor of economics at UC Berkeley. And for the first couple years of the administration, I got to learn from Shalanda about how to both be analytically rigorous and actually useful, which is very, very hard. And it's hopefully lessons that we're bringing here today and that we're just so excited to be able to share with you now. So a huge thanks to our team. Again, I get to be the one up here presenting these initial results, but it obviously leans on all of our work over hours and days and weeks and months, so thank you. We are just very excited to be able to share with you our first two reports on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and the Child Tax Credit. So what are we doing? What are we trying to do here? We are bringing an academic, nonpartisan perspective to try to do two things: to democratize and innovate on the budget scoring process, to try to quantify the trade-offs that Shalanda emphasized are there, they're real, and they're hard to understand. And so the more information, transparent, easy to use, easy to understand that policymakers, voters, the press have, hopefully the better outcomes that we get, more in line with what voters want. We are trying to do this in sort of two ways, and we chose our two policies here to showcase the democratization half and the innovation half. Let's start with the democratization. So what do we mean by that? All of us in this room have had some experience at some point where I wonder how much this tax proposal or spending proposal would cost or raise if we increased the phase-out range or made it less generous this way or applied to these taxpayers. That's very hard to do. It's hard to do in a campaign context, hard to do in a policy staffer context, and without the long lag that is needed for the precise estimates from the Congressional Budget Office, the Joint Committee on Tax, or other scorekeeping entities. And so what we have created for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is a do-it-yourself online portal where you can go right now and start turning the dials. And we have tried to put our best brains forward here to come up with the different interactions that we run in the background so that when you mix and match, you can get approximate scores and distributions that give you a sense of who's going to win, who's going to lose, what's the impact on the deficit, both in the current year and beyond. So what's the same and what's different from what you are used to seeing? The same is that we have a 10-year conventional score, we have a 10-year dynamic score, and we are producing the distribution analyses that would typically accompany these scores either right away or on a lag. But we are also extending everything to 30 years with a focus on intergenerational impacts when appropriate. We're going to showcase that with the child tax credit, and that's one of our key innovation areas. And along the way, we are going to do more like administrative burden, which I'm going to show you today. How long does it take you to file your taxes? When there are certain economic assumptions that we think that recent research has suggested, maybe the capital gains elasticity should be a little bit lower than what is being used in the standard scorekeeping analyses. Document that, take a targeted approach, and lay out our reasoning that we hope everyone in this room would be able to read and start and nod their heads and say, yeah, that makes sense. And that's where things should go. So let's start with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. As a reminder, much of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expires on December 31st of next year. That's going to do two things. It's going to restrain deficits. That's already baked into the CBO baseline. If there weren't these expirations, the baseline deficits would be larger in that baseline. And that comes at the cost of higher taxes across the income distribution. There's already a lot of discussion about whether this expiration time will be a moment for tax reform in this country again. And so what we provide are those do-it-yourself, transparent analyses of how you mix and match different options that could be on the table. And we're generally aiming to match CBO and JCT, so what you're getting is fast, comprehensive, do-it-yourself in real time. But there are going to be these targeted areas, like I was just mentioning, where when we deviate, we'll call it out and explain why we're deviating. And then hopefully that ends up being something that people agree with, and then other entities incorporate. So specifically, you can think about what happens under expiration in two buckets, one that affects everybody and one that affects only the highest earners. So affecting everybody, tax rates are going to rise across the board. We're going to revert back to the lower standard deduction and higher exemptions to compensate as we had before 2017, and the child tax credit is going to fall in half. At the high end, the cap on state and local tax deductions expires. The 20% tax subsidy to pass through business income concentrated at the top, called QBI, will expire. And then the estate tax exemption will fall by half, so more of the wealthiest Americans will have a state tax due if they die. Okay, so how are we going to anchor these analyses? We're going to look at 3 reform options that, again, you can create your own, but just to talk through what could be on the table, we have looked at a full extension option, which just takes current policy and extends it all the way forward. A partial extension policy that does full extension, but aims to concentrate the tax benefits only in the bottom 99%. How does it do that? It allows the top bracket rate to rise to 39.6, and it eliminates the QBI deduction. Those are unpaid for. We also analyze the policy, the proposal, by our own Natasha Sarin and Kim Clausing, formerly of Treasury, that would extend TCJA at the bottom, except for the rate cuts, so think of the standard deduction and other child tax credit and other components, but then is more than paid for through $4 trillion of deficit reduction from progressive revenue raisers. So it's one way to look at combining deficit reduction along with extensions. All right, everyone, put on your lab coats and enter the budget lab. So we're going to start with the deficit picture and then go into distribution and then a couple longer run analyses. So in black here is effectively the CBO baseline. The little down dips in 2033 and 2028 come through mandatory changes to Medicare that are already in the baseline. What you see here is that there are big stakes at play. So if there is full extension, primary deficits will be 1% of GDP higher every year going forward. In contrast, obviously, pairing with deficit reduction, you can reduce primary deficits. And what would it take to get to debt stabilization? It's something around the Clausing-Sarin proposal that would reduce primary deficits down to about 1% of GDP. So there's enormous stakes at play here. And just to note, if you are a close reader of the president's budget, as many of you are, the president's proposal would be something in the middle of partial extension and Clausing-Sarin that would do partial extension but would be fully paid for. And so the deficit picture would look similar to the black line. Okay, so we see that there are big stakes at play. 1% of GDP. Who's going to win and who's going to lose from these different proposals? So we're going to retain the color scheme, red, yellow, and blue for Clausing-Sarin, partial extension, and full extension, and now show you changes in after-tax income across the income distribution. And for now, I've deliberately left out the top 1% so we can just focus on working middle and upper middle class families. So what you see are two contrasting patterns of after-tax income changes depending on the type of reform proposal here. Full extension and partial extension are basically identical below the top 1%. That's why you can't really see the yellow line. And in that scenario, after-tax incomes rise across the board between 1% and 2%, with the largest increases at middle incomes and higher middle incomes. In contrast, under a Clausing-Sarin proposal, which couples full refundability of the child tax credit with progressive revenue raisers like a higher corporate income tax, at the very bottom, the main beneficiaries of full refundability of the child tax credit, after-tax incomes rise enormously, so call it 8% increases in after-tax income, that then tapers down with income gains through the middle income bracket, and then in the top quintile, net losses. So net tax revenue raised from the top 20%. Now what happens in the top 1%? This is where full refundability and full extension and partial extension differ. When that top bracket rate rises and the state and local tax deduction limits deductions at the top 1% and especially in the top 0.1% end up paying more taxes on net, so they're partially clawing back that deficit reduction, the extra deficits that full extension would imply. And instead, Clausing-Sarin raises revenue a great deal from the top 1%. Now, let's focus for a second on this upper middle class dot here. The largest income gains under full extension and partial extension. Where is that coming from? That's the upper middle class, call it incomes $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a year. Why are they getting the greatest benefits? So we can take these dots, and specifically the blue dots, and break out for you. And again, this is the type of analysis that we are hoping will be useful as people are mixing and matching policy reform proposals, and say, where does that net increase of 2% come from? And you can see that the bulk of it comes from the little discussed expansion in the alternative minimum tax exemption. I won't go into all of the color-coded brackets, but this is the kind of thing that you can do and say, wait a minute, I want more of that, I want less of that, and you can see that transparently showing up here. Okay, so this is distribution analysis, hopefully laid out transparently. One of the features of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was an attempt to simplify the tax code to reduce the time burden that taxpayers face in complying with the tax code. we are able to quantify that. And under current law, the average taxpayer will face a burden of 14 hours to comply with tax law. Because under current law, we lose the big standard deduction, more taxpayers are going to itemize their deductions, and that's particularly burdensome. In all three of the reform proposals, the standard deduction is maintained. There are fewer taxpayers who are itemizing their deductions, and that's showing up in a 10% reduction in the time burden of complying with the tax code. And that's the type of analysis that, it's part of the reason to do tax reform. It comes up every time, and here are the estimates that we can use alongside policy decisions of the brass tacks, dollars in and dollars out. Okay, so this is one innovation to bring that along into the automatic discussions of these policies as numbers come off the analyses. We also are intent on extending past the decade. So in everything we do, we will provide 30-year estimates, not just 10-year estimates. And in this graph and the last graph for Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we're showing you estimates out to 30 years. And this graph is showing you net interest outlays as a share of GDP from now to 2055. Notice the y-axis. These numbers are very large, ranging from 3% to 8% of GDP, and we get different net interest paths. So what's going on? Under baseline, primary deficits are adding to debt as a share of GDP. That mechanically increases net interest as a share of GDP, but also there's feedback into interest rates. We're following conventions outlined that other scorekeepers use, and we're using macroeconomic modeling from the Fed's FERBIS model to analyze alterations to that baseline path. Under full extension and partial extension, which are not paid for, what happens? Well, you have higher deficits that mechanically adds to higher net interest, but then also feeds back through higher interest rates. The exact opposite happens in clausing Sarin. You actually get lower interest rates through the deficit reduction relative to the baseline, and that shows up in GDP projections. So here's a mirror image graph that has different implications, albeit at small y-axes impacts in the short and long run. So what's happening here? Under full extension and partial extension, this is a net tax cut. It's putting cash in the bank accounts of American families. They're spending it. That is an impulse to aggregate demand. That increases GDP in the short run until the Fed's inertial interest Taylor rule brings the economy back into balance. And the opposite is happening for the deficit-reducing clausing Sarin proposal. That's in the short run. In the long run, what happens? In the long run, higher interest rates under full and partial extension reduce GDP modestly relative to baseline, up to 0.5% of GDP cumulatively, that's not per year, cumulatively over 30 years. And the opposite happens in clausing Sarin despite the higher corporate tax rate, for example, that the interest rate effect swamps other effects from higher taxes. So hopefully these end up being useful as you and others are crafting different policy responses over the next year and a half. To move on to part two, the child tax credit. A big part of what Shalanda was describing and our motivation as young parents or parents-to-be is thinking about the next generation. And there is bipartisan interest in various policies that support families. A key feature of investments in children, as Shalanda emphasized, is that they take decades to pay off. There's never been, at least probably to rounding error, an investment in a 5-year-old that has had revenue feedback in the budget window. They are not earning wages, at least legally, by age 15. But by age 25, 35, are their wages going to be higher thanks to government policy today? We want to help bring to bear research that is very much ongoing but has really made advances in the last 10, 15 years to help put numbers and a methodology behind how we think about policy today impacting earnings and tax revenue in the next generation. And that, we think, can hopefully help policymakers in those key quantitative trade-offs. Not every policy is going to do everything. A child tax credit policy definitely reduces poverty today. It may increase wages in the next generation less than universal pre-K. And that's a type of analyses that we want to put numbers on to guide conversations as policymakers decide how best to support families. So we wanted to start our analyses on these intergenerational impacts with the simplest policy, a cash policy, the child tax credit. There's been a lot of policy movement in the child tax credit space, so that's also helpful in making it tangible and relevant to current debates. As a reminder, current policy is that there's a maximum child tax credit of $2,000 per child. This is not fully refundable, so if you don't have much tax liability, you do not get to benefit from that $2,000, or at least not in full. And after expiration, it's going to fall in half to $1,000. And we study 4 policy scenarios, again, to anchor discussions around this. First, we take the current policy and just extend it forward. Second, we take the Family Security Act 2.0 from Senators Romney, Daines, and Burr, which is an expansion in the maximum child tax credit, a steep phase-in, so more low-income taxpayers get to benefit in full from that maximum, coupled with pay-fors from the top and from the middle class. So the top gets hit with state and local tax deduction limitations, and the middle and working class see reductions in other child benefits, including earned income tax credit benefits. So it's more than fully paid for, and it's kind of a swap of benefits at the bottom middle class. We then study 2 not fully paid for policies, the 2021 law of expanded child tax credit with full refundability, so 0 earners get the full amount if they have children, and the Wendy Edelberg and Melissa Kearney proposal, which mirrors in many respects the 2021 law, but has limited refundability. So if you're a 0 earner, you get approximately half of the amount instead of the full amount. Okay, dust off the lab coats. Here we are. We're gonna start with the deficit picture. And again, the stakes at play here are apparent. Remember, full extension of TCJA cost about 1% of GDP per year. The CTC is 1/4 of that. So we're talking big dollars here. You can see that in the light blue line relative to the black line. And then we've split out the FSA proposal into just the CTC component in red for apples-to-apples comparisons, but then the full proposal in the dotted line, which include the pay-fors. Now you see that the pay-fors make a huge difference. Let's look at who wins and who loses from this policy. Here we have the same graph as we had before, percent changes in after-tax income across the income distribution. The child tax credit, when coupled with either full refundability, partial, a lot more refundability than we have now, or a steep phase-in as in the Romney, Daines, Burr proposal, generate, again, very large percentage impacts at the bottom quintile. So I showed you for full extension, right, there were 8% increases in after-tax income. Half of that's coming from the child tax credit alone. And then, interestingly, in the fully paid for version, there's a swap in who's benefiting. And I wanted you to look at the bottom 3 quintiles here. The bottom quintile benefits by about 1% of their after-tax income. The middle quintile, those middle earners, benefit by the same amount. But the second quintile does not. They get only a tiny boost. Why? That's the earned income tax credit and other components of the pay-for. So it's more generous to the lowest earners, but relatively more generous to them than it is to the second quintile earners, although they still do benefit a little bit on that. Now, how do we take this forward to the next generation? You're gonna see my smile light up because this is such a fun and active area of academic research, and for kid investments, just really can be central. For family support policies, we really do need later life impacts. How do we get those? Well, for the child tax credit, the key number we need is the causal impact of parental cash today on child earnings in the next generation. We have tried to summarize and come to a number by asking the version of that question as follows. We know that low-income kids and high-income kids grow up to earn different amounts as adults. That's what we see in the data in real life right now, and we actually have very precise estimates of that now, thanks to recent research from the last 15 years. That pattern, that relationship between parent and child income, how much of that is causal? How much of that is the causal impact of literally having less cash at home? Is it 100%? Is it 0%, or is it something in the middle? With the help of Marianne Page, a recent paper by economist Marianne Page, we have constructed this graph and added to it, which takes studies, and you can look at the years of these studies. These are not old studies. They are a building area of research that takes cash and cash-like programs like SNAP, like food stamps, and either directly measures impacts on earnings or impacts on test scores that then are transformed into earnings impacts based on the test score to earnings relationship seen in other work. These estimates of the causal share of that parent-child earnings relationship are wide. They widely vary, and they kind of should. The first dollar of food stamps is going to have a larger impact on children's outcomes than the last dollar. So there's going to be temporal changes, there are going to be policy changes along the way. The mean estimate in this literature is about 30%. The median is 10%. In our judgment, we think 20% is a good starting point for the causal share. That 20% of the difference in later life outcomes of low-income kids versus high-income kids is literally the causal impact of the cash at home. So what do we do with that number? We take the full matrix of every parent rank relating to every child rank, and we, for every hypothetical person in 2050, assign them to a parent with an income level that matches what we see in the real world. We then apply these CTC reform proposals to that family, to that parent's income, multiply that income by 20%, and then ask ourselves, the people who earn a bit more, that 20% more in the real world, how much higher are those kids' earnings later? And we assign our kids those hypothetically richer kids' earnings. Now that is the first place that you want to start, and we want to say that this is really our first place to start. We do not incorporate general equilibrium impacts, such as if the proposal is unpaid for, that's going to result in higher interest rates that can reduce wages on net. That's not part of this analysis here. Okay, so what do we find? This is our last graph, and we want to leave you with 3 points from this initial analysis of intergenerational impacts of child tax credit reform proposals. The first is that giving cash raises kids' earnings in the next generation by modest but potentially important amounts. So take a $50,000 earner. The proposals that are most weighted toward the bottom quintile raise those earnings by about 1%, so think about $500 a year extra. On average, the earnings impacts are 0.5%, so that's $250 a year. And at the fully paid for proposal or the current extension, 0.2%, that's $100 a year extra. So not life transformative, but not nothing. The second is that the pattern of benefits really do depend on the type of proposal you're doing. If you just do full refundability, it's very heavily weighted to the bottom quintile. If you have impacts that are, if you pay for it partially through low and middle income clawbacks of policies, that's going to mute those results. And the third, and kind of one that surprised me, we had to look at it closely, is that even top quintile kids benefit, and even in the fully paid for proposal. So what's going on there? I thought they were paying net taxes on this. They were taking net cash away. Part of what's going on there besides some re-ranking across parents with kids versus parents without kids, is that there's redistribution happening. If you are a high earner who doesn't have kids, you don't benefit from the child tax credit. You only get hit with the tax increases. But if you have kids, you benefit from that child tax credit, and so on net, your family can actually increase in resources, and on average in the top quintile, there's some modest increase in resources, and we see that appearing here in some benefits for even top quintile kids. So with that, I hope that these two test-driven reports, one on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expiring next year, and on child tax credit reform proposals, showcase what we are trying to do here as bringing academic work in a nonpartisan way to democratize and innovate on the budget scoring process with transparent tools that you can use to help drive toward policy outcomes that better match voters and voters' welfare. So thank you very much. And with that, let me invite Martha back up.
So I'm very excited to introduce our panel, which is being moderated by Greg Ip of the Wall Street Journal, so we're very grateful to him. We have Josh Bolten, the CEO of the Business Roundtable, but also the former director of the Office of Management and Budget and the White House Chief of Staff for President George W. Bush. And we have Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who is the CEO of the American Action Forum, but also the former director of the Congressional Budget Office and economic policy advisor to Senator John McCain. Last but not least, making a break for it, is Natasha Sarin, co-founder and president of the Budget Lab at Yale. So thanks so much to the panelists for taking their time, and we're excited to hear from all of you.
I'm on the end.
Thanks very much, everybody, for coming here, and thank you, Natasha, and for everybody for the Budget Lab for both organizing the event and for coming up with this idea. One of the questions I was going to end with, I'm actually going to start with because I'm going to answer myself, which is, do we need another budget think tank? And I will answer in the affirmative, yes, we do. I've been covering fiscal policy in one shape or form for about 30 years, and I will grant that I'm probably more interested in this than the median voter. But nonetheless, even I sometimes run up against a dearth of really good quantitative, rigorous analysis with which to sort of like make conclusions. And so in my view, you can't have too much of this sort of stuff. And I think that what you guys are doing is actually filling a valuable role in this. So thank you. Let me just start with that. Today, we're going to try and expand beyond some of the technical issues that we just heard about from Danny and talk about some of the issues that are right now pressing on us as a country and ways to address them. And perhaps some of the more structural issues, particularly budget process, and Natasha, you've written about. I am going to start more broadly with a question that I think a lot of people have been asking for the last year, especially since interest rates started going up. It's brought back, I think, to mind the question of, well, to go back to my career, fiscal policy has been unsustainable more or less since I started 20 years ago, and it continues to be unsustainable, and yet it continues to be sustained. It continues to be sustained. Last year, though, it felt like we were having a bit of a wake-up call where we had a variety of events from failed budget, from poor treasury auctions to downgrades, and a big upward move in long-term rates, and it kind of felt like we were finally meeting that moment when the world was recognizing that our fiscal situation was becoming unsustainable. So let me just put the question as broadly as possible to the panel, starting with you, Josh. How much closer is a fiscal crisis or some kind of like crunch point when you look at everything going on right now, and should we be worried?
In order and answer to your questions, I have no idea, and yes. But I'll expand on that a little bit, just to say, first of all, Natasha, thank you to you and your colleagues at Yale. I'm in complete agreement with Greg on the immediate value and I think the potential great value of what you're doing. So I'm pleased to have a chance to be here to support the initiative. Greg, my experience is the same as yours. My career goes even farther back. and fiscal policy has always been, not always been, but has been unsustainable for at least the last 20, maybe 25 years. Well, I would say with a brief exception of, with the 3 years that I served as the budget director, when everything looked entirely sustainable. But the challenge we face is that not even the best economists in America or the world, every one of them can tell us with confidence that our budget trajectory is unsustainable, and you only have to look at some of the charts that have been presented earlier today to recognize that. None of them can say when the moment of unsustainability will hit, and persuading politicians to deal with a crisis that may be inevitable, but may well not be inevitable during the tenures in which they operate is very difficult to do on the one hand, and persuading ordinary Americans of this is even more difficult to do. So all of us who care about the budget face a great challenge, both of educating the public and getting our political leaders to care enough about this issue to jeopardize their own careers.
Doug?
Well, let me first just begin by also saying thank you for the chance to be here, and congratulations on the launch, and you know, and endorse the idea of innovation in analysis of the budget. And all these innovations are great, with the sole exception of holding budget events at 4 o'clock on Fridays.
There's wine to come, so not for me, but for everyone else.
I think the distressing part about this sort of 21st century phenomenon is that it has been, we don't have the political economy to stop the upward rise, the inevitable upward rise in debt relative to GDP, or whatever your favorite metric of potential for disaster is. And that's been the source of the downgrades. No one has said the United States economy is broken, it cannot possibly find the resources to fund these national priorities. That's not the issue. The issue has been our ability to manage our finances, witness debt ceiling showdowns and government shutdowns and things like that. And so, to me, the education process that Josh mentioned is the central issue. There has to be, the case has to be brought to the American people in a really direct way that the federal budget is a danger. It is a danger now. There's an enormous benefit to you and your successive generations to taking care of it. And that can then produce more consensus and bipartisan consensus over the path forward. And that's the #1 priority right now.
Natasha?
So first, I want to be sure to thank Josh and Doug for being here, but also for providing a ton of guidance to us over the course of the last many months, and to thank the people in this room who have been on the phone with us as we've been working through this analysis, sometimes agreeing, sometimes disagreeing, but always providing thoughtful and constructive feedback, and we are so grateful. To the sort of broader question of like what the dynamics are and the nature of fiscal crises and when to expect them, I think there's sort of a whole set of challenges here. One is that, you know, if you look at CBO's most recent projections, debt to GDP ratios are expected to rise to 116% at current law. But if you do some version of deficit finance tax extensions, they're going to rise to something like over 130% over the course of the next decade. And that sounds like those numbers are huge and scary and unsustainable. The challenge, I think, is that we've been in this posture where, and this goes to what Josh was saying about like, I can't tell you when it's going to happen. It was like, we can't have a debt to GDP ratio above 80. We can't have one above 90. We can't have one above 100. And so there's always been this construct, it's almost like Boy Who Cried Wolfie, that like there is some magic number or some threshold that we're going to hit that makes sort of our fiscal posture unsustainable. And that's not to say that I'm like downplaying the real risks and costs of having a sort of view towards the deficit that is not really front of mind and first order for policymakers. There certainly are, and you're starting to like live through them now. Interest costs are higher for households and are going to continue to be higher. The fiscal space, the thing I worry most about, frankly, is like the fiscal space to make the kinds of investments on the spending side that I would really like to see in kids and in the climate. You kind of, I understand that we don't necessarily know where or when, but the fact that you start being worried about our debt dynamics just crowds out the capacity to do a lot of what I think needs to be done. And so the conversation that I'm super keen for us all to have, and what I hope the Budget Lab facilitates us having, is to think through not just quantifying what some of these longer term risks are, but also to think through what are the costs of high and growing deficits, who bears them, who in future generations is actually hurt by some of the choices that we make today, and why does that matter? And I think being able to show policymakers that has some value, because you're being able to say sort of concretely, like, these are the choice sets that you face, and with our analytical tools, sort of make the choice that you prefer.
Those are great points, and I hope we can get back to some of this on the budget process part later in the discussion, but sticking for a moment with the fiscal outlook, certainly you're right, we blew through 60, we blew through 70, we blew through 80% of debt to GDP, and nobody worried. And in fact, through this period, interest rates actually went down. You know, we were at the zero nominal bound. And in his presidential address to the American Economic Association a few years ago, Olivier Blanchard, I think, sort of laid out for us the R minus G model, which is as long as the interest rate is below the growth rate, the debt tends towards stability. And that was at a time when interest rates were persistently roughly 2 percentage points below growth rates. But we're not in that situation any longer. Interest rates are roughly equal to or higher than growth rates. So a 90% debt to GDP ratio at today is different than it was 5 or 6 years ago. In addition to which, we're also running a fairly large primary deficit, larger than we were a few years ago. Does that, in your view, change? Is that a game changer? Should that change things the way we think about this and the cone of risks out there?
So it certainly should, right? And it certainly should. The way that we think about R&G dynamics has to be like the governing principle over which we decide whether debt is sustainable or unsustainable. And the thing that I think is like important for us all to, I don't know if everyone agrees with this, this is sort of what I think. If you told me that debt to GDP ratios were gonna be high forever at a number, let's say 150 forever, I actually think that that world might be a fine world. The challenge is whether or not we know, sort of from a trajectory perspective, we know the direction spending is going, we know the direction our demographics are going. What we don't know is whether we are gonna find the political will to be able to raise revenues to meet those spending needs. And I think that's the real challenge. It's actually not a level point, it's more of a trend point. And that has to be the way that we think about the future and the way that we think about these dynamics. I want to be sort of very specific. Like the number one thing that keeps me up at night, maybe this is different for Josh and Doug, is not the deficit. It's just not. The number one thing that keeps me up at night is whether or not we are going to be able to be in a position to invest, frankly, and this has become, I know it's been referenced a few times today, but it's become like this deeply personal thing that like, are we gonna, you know, Martha, Danny, and I, by the end of July, are gonna have 4 children under 2. Like, are we going to be in a position? I know. I just like, it's like the deficit is definitely not going to be the thing keeping us up at night. But like, are we going to be in a position where we do right by them and where we're able to find the space to do right by them? And I'm just worried that we aren't going to be. And that's kind of why some of this analysis strikes me as first order.
Well, when you're awake at 2 a.m. trying to get your baby back to sleep, just tell yourself.
2 babies.
2 babies. Sorry, making Social Security solvent in the long run.
Yeah, exactly.
Outside the budget window. Doug, what do you think? Does it keep you up at night any longer? When you were CBO director, it was supposed to keep you up at night. Should it be keeping you more up at night nowadays?
I'm really concerned. I won't pretend otherwise. I mean, there's always this This comes up all the time, like when you testify. They say, what's the tipping point? Is it 120, 130? And my answer has always been, I don't know, and I don't want to run the experiment. Why don't we simply, not find out, and do what the Budget Lab folks are suggesting. Imagine a fiscal policy that actually has a purpose and recognizes future costs and benefits as much as present costs and benefits, and let's figure out where to go. And you can take the crisis off the table by just stabilizing debt relative to GDP and pointing it a little bit south. And then world capital markets know it's not going to blow up. And now we're discussing which fiscal trajectory makes sense. And, so that's the discussion I'd like to have. I mean, there's no one out there that has ever made the case that the U.S. has become, quote, dynamically inefficient. We've overaccumulated capital. So we are literally picking who gets to live well, us versus the next generations. I think we're picking poorly, and I would like to pick differently.
Do you want to add anything to that, Josh?
Well, first of all, I agree with all of what Doug just said. From the standpoint of keeping me up at night, I take myself back 20 years to when Mitch Daniels was handing over the reins of the Office of Management and Budget to me, and we had a conversation about how worried we both were that large deficits that were building up in the early years of the Bush administration due to a mild recession and then spending on wars in Iraq and Afghanistan might have the risk of pushing our debt to GDP ratio above 40% of GDP. And we were horrified that we would get a steep market reaction at 40%. We actually didn't exceed 40% during the course of the Bush years, but with the 2008 financial crisis, we jumped from 40 to 60. And then somehow we jumped from 60 to 80 over the course of Obama and early Trump, and then we jumped from 80 to 100, almost inconceivable with the pandemic, and yet no reaction from the financial markets, no punishment in the bond markets. If you ask the members of the organization that I now serve, the Business Roundtable, which is about 225 CEOs of big American companies, they will tell you they're worried. We asked them, and they said, over 2/3 of them said that they're either concerned or very concerned about the fiscal trajectory of the United States over the course of the next few years. And they're concerned for two reasons. The most important and biggest one is that we're not going to know when the crisis is upon us until it actually hits. In other words, if and when, I'm totally with Doug, let's not run the experiment, let's not plan to have the crisis, but if and when the crisis hits, it will be quite visible, and it will be far too late to do anything about it. Interest rates will skyrocket, the dollar may plummet, we will put at risk the status of the dollar as the world's reserve currency, which is probably a central element of why we haven't experienced a crisis already. And what the CEOs see is the basically collapse of the American economy to it, which is essential to the prosperity of their enterprises. The other thing they worry about is that the reaction to the possibility of this crisis, which is that a consensus may develop in our political system that the way to deal with it is to tax corporations. And most of them, by the way, they're rich people, and they pay a lot of tax already. I've never heard a single one of them complain about it. I mean, they're all at least in the 50% tax bracket. That doesn't bother them. They're probably so wealthy that it doesn't really matter, but every one of them is concerned about the possibility of making it uncompetitive to do business in the United States. And every single one of them wants to grow here in the United States. They make a lot of money, most of them make a lot of money overseas as well, but where they would really like to see the growth and the employment is right here at home, and they don't want to be put into the position that we were in prior to the 2017 TCJA of having to make tough choices about moving people and assets and resources overseas because it's uncompetitive to do business here.
And maybe I'll just say two things on what Josh just said, and I'm curious if I hope we get to dig into some of the particulars of tax reform in this conversation.
But it seems like we're heading in that direction.
Well,
yeah.
so there's like two pieces. One is, and Josh will remember this, of course, with respect to the corporate rate, there's like two things I think we all should grapple with. One is that TCJA came in at a corporate rate cut from 34% to 21%. What Business Roundtable had aspired for and what its members had aspired for at the time was a corporate rate of 25%. So actually, even sort of industry, and as they thought about and grappled with where's the scope and what's competitive, had a number in mind that is lower than that is higher than the number that we landed on. And that comes at real revenue costs. That just is, and that's a choice that we have to make and have to grapple with. The other piece that I think is important, and it's sort of related to our research on TCJA, is that if you look at the sort of estimates and the research that's been done, there's a great new paper by Gabe Trojer-Reich at Harvard, Owen Zadar, Eric Swick, and Matt Smith, who's at Treasury, where they kind of try to sort of scope out the extent to which you've seen the increases in investment and the increases in capital formation that you would expect, sort of textbook, that you expect when you see substantial corporate rate cuts, when you see 100% bonus depreciation, when you see these expensing provisions that were central tenets of TCJA. And what you see, the textbook stuff is true, but it's also true. And so you see an increase in investment, you see what you're expecting, but what's true is that they are so outweighed by the static revenue loss of a 14% corporate rate cut that in aggregate, you're actually not seeing some of the effects that Josh is talking about as he pushes for, and he totally rightfully is focused on making this country and making corporations in this country sort of a competitive and driving force of economic growth. And I say all of these things because I am sort of animated by the idea that there is a lot of scope to design tax packages that are pro-growth, that are creating a level playing field, not just here in the United States, but with respect to Pillar 2 and the OECD and international tax reform that puts multinationals on a level playing field, so you can't just decide which jurisdiction to operate in and kind of pick paying 0% as your preferred tax rate. But also one that recognizes that as we're grappling with some of these fiscal concerns and our concerns about debts and deficits, thinking seriously about the ways that corporate tax reform can help us address some of those concerns, has to be part of the conversation. And I think that I actually think Josh, broadly, he probably doesn't agree with the particulars, and if we sat down together, we probably wouldn't design a package that was identical or to that was sort of our dream in either one of our versions. But I think talking through some of those trade-offs seriously seems hugely important. And it's hugely important for one of the reasons Josh said, which is earlier this week, Jamie Dimon sort of wrote in his letter to shareholders that JP Morgan is preparing for medium-term interest rates that could be somewhere from 2% to 8%. So steep fiscal costs that government is bearing and the feedback loop to higher interest rates faced not just by companies but by American households as you're looking to buy a car or buy a house. These are real concerns that are animating the corporate community, and totally rightfully so. I just think that we should be having a holistic conversation about the ways in which to address them that thinks about both sides of the ledger very seriously.
Well, I mean, I'm not actually sure whether the standard deviation of a 2 to 8% treasury yield is any larger than what they ought to be using in their value
Yeah, no, that's
models.
fair.
But it probably
8
sounds
just
good
seems
in the
scary,
context.
yeah.
All that said, we're facing a deadline in the sense at the end of 2025, the new president, the new Congress will actually have to decide what to do with the TCJA. And like simply extending everything as it exists, including all the personal tax cuts, would be extremely expensive and would aggravate the debt and deficit issues that we talked about. How should we fix that? Josh, I know that you want to keep the corporate rate cut. How do we therefore fix the revenue losses associated with extending that law?
Well, first of all, just to come back for a second on what Natasha mentioned, you would think that a reduction from 34 or 35 to 21% would be, just totally out of the range of expectations and a huge game changer. It has been a game changer, but what the people who complain about that reduction don't usually mention is the TCJA offset 3/4 of that cut with other tax increases, including essentially an international minimum tax, which has turned out to be very successful. Now, you would think that with having brought it down from 34 to 21%, we would be one of the most competitive tax jurisdictions in the OECD. We're not. We're in the bottom half. We're 15th currently have the 15th highest taxes out of the 38 members of the OECD. And you raise that 21% just 1 or 2 ticks, and you'll put us squarely in the bottom quartile. You raise it to what President Biden has requested, and you'll put the U.S. once again dead last in the OECD and start driving business once again out of the U.S. So I think we ought to approach the question with some humility about what can or should be accomplished on the side of taxing business. Overall, though, we do have a challenge that needs to be met. And the thing we haven't talked about yet is what really is the challenge in our budget situation.
Josh, I don't want to let you off too lightly because I want to stay on the TCJA
Yeah,
for a
stay
second.
with us.
We're going to
Yeah.
talk about taxes, or because because one of my questions is, what do we do about the TCJA overall and all those expiring tax provisions?
Personally, I think they should be extended, and they should be. There's lots of stuff that can be done at the margins, but the last thing I would look to impose a tax increase above what we have now is not the individual stuff. It's the corporate stuff, because that is the seed corn of our country. And I think we have to accept that the TCJA will put a real fiscal challenge on us. But where I was trying to go was, what that fiscal challenge should force us to do is start addressing the real drivers of our deficit and debt that are not that we are an undertaxed society. We are not.
Doug?
So, first of all, the shameless self-promotion is former Ways and Means Chairman Kevin Brady and I have an op-ed in this morning's Wall Street Journal on what I think we should do with the TCJA. If you like the op-ed, thank Kevin. All errors responsible here. I think the wrong way to frame this is to ask the question, do we want to keep it or extend it permanently? We want to look at 2025 as a chance to have a tax reform to give us the tax code we need to go forward. 2017 did a lot of good things. It was the first time in 30 years we'd undertaken serious tax reform. Shouldn't wait another 30 years. This is a great opportunity. Something has to happen. So let's do something that is very pro-growth, which maintains the revenue. Can't afford another, sort of revenue decline like $1.5 trillion last time. And, you know, let's not pretend that somehow we got it all right in 2017. We didn't. I mean, you know, and importantly, more than 1/2 of business income is taxed on individual returns through pass-through entities. The benchmark should be that the effective tax rate on capital in the corporate sector and the pass-through sector is the same. It's not. And so there is a lot of tax reform work left to be done. A lot of base broadening, a lot of rate equalization that generates fairness and growth, and that should be the objective.
Yeah, I just wanted, like, sort of, I wholly agree with Doug in the broad framework of, like, thinking about 2025 as not a TCJA and what gets extended, but more generally as a tax reform moment, strikes me as, like, hugely valuable. And, like, in particular, things that I would be, like, particularly excited to see in such a package includes, on the corporate side, it includes trying to think about, the rest of the world is kind of moving on Pillar 2. Like, the rest of the world is, like, in a place where a 15% minimum tax is, like, the rate that they are sort of applying and going to apply, such that if you're a U.S. multinational who operates in France, the U.S. is like, and decides not to implement against the OECD, the U.S. is going to be in a state where we are sacrificing tax revenue to other jurisdictions who are just collecting it from exactly the same multinationals. So it strikes me that that should be a place where there should be some capacity for us to make progress. It also strikes me that there should be some capacity for us to make progress, to Doug's point. Some of those differences between how we treat pass-throughs and how we treat C-corps, they not only create differences in tax treatment, they're also hugely distortionary and inefficient, because you put a lot of energy in trying to figure out, and a lot of tax planning energy, in trying to figure out how should I classify myself such that I get to face the lowest rate. And that energy and productive capacity can surely find better uses in the US economy than that. The one thing I want to be sure to say about what I'm hoping to see in 2025, and ideally would be hoping to see well before then, is I think on the individual side, I don't want to like sort of undercredit what 2017 did with respect to the child tax credit and meaningfully helping more children in need. But it left the job very substantially undone, because in ways that the American Rescue Plan actually tried to push against usefully, in that full refundability, such that the most vulnerable children in this country, the 19 million kids who today are in poverty because they do not have access to these resources in this cash, strikes me as, like, I can't really see a policy argument against it other than we think we can't afford it. But trust me, we can. And some of these tax reform measures can usefully be funding exactly those types of investments.
There's a fascinating part of this conversation, to me at least, which is that there's a vigorous debate going on about which parts of the corporate reform should be kept and which should be changed, and so on. But there seems to be an implicit agreement among the three of you, despite your different political leanings, that the individual rates should be left where they are. I find this fascinating.
Say that.
What?
I don't
didn't
think
say that.
I don't think that either.
Okay.
I don't
Sorry, the individual rates for the 98% of people below $400,000.
I didn't say that either.
I don't
All right.
know that either.
Okay, well, let me start with you then, Natasha.
Why don't you ask us a question
Okay.
and we'll answer it.
Didn't you say that we should extend the credit?
No.
Extend it? Yeah.
I said the worst way to think about this is either.
I don't even think Josh kind of was like,
say that.
No, you
No,
did say, you said you should keep, extend everything.
I didn't think I needed to say that I didn't say that I didn't say that.
Oh, well, this is a relief
here,
then. So I just a misunderstanding.
if asked, I would say we shouldn't touch the corporate rate. Let it stay at 21,
Yeah.
and we need to raise rates on the individual side because people need to pay for the government they're consuming.
Okay. So, all right, good. Thank you. Thank you for correcting me on that one. Too many double negatives in there, I think. But I'll put the question to you, Natasha, because this is obviously the funny thing I think about the TCJA and the corporate individual rate cuts is, in fact, individual rate cut, people, when they're asked in front of elections, whether it was in 2000 or in 2016, what do you want most? Almost nobody says, I want a lower tax rate. And then Republican presidents and Congresses are elected and give it to them. And then Democrats say, I don't want to take that away from them. And so we end up with this consensus today that I find fascinating, that the view of the Republican Party is that taxes must never go up on 100% of taxpayers. And the view of the Democratic Party is they must never go up on 98% of taxpayers. And I don't know where that came from, because obviously I don't see how maintaining never raising taxes on people making as much as $400,000 is consistent with your progressive goals. So explain it to me. How did we end up here, and should we be maintaining that assumption?
So Michael Gratz has a great new book about the rise of the anti-tax movement in the United States that I highly recommend that everyone read. And I will answer the question, but I want to reject sort of the false equivalence of the two comparisons here, right? Because like on one side of the aisle, you have 44 sitting senators and more than 250 congressmen who have signed a pledge to never raise taxes on anyone. And on that, if you look at President Biden's Green Book, you have $5 trillion of revenue raisers over a decade.
On the top 2%.
So no, I'm about to, so
yeah,
I take the point, but I just want to say that those are like fundamentally different conceptions of the world. And I think there is, as a person who believes in a more progressive tax code, I actually think there is logic in trying to say that if you are starting to think seriously about where revenue can come from, starting from those at the top of the distribution who, even Josh is telling us, like, are not complaining that their taxes are too high, is like a totally reasonable way to think about tax policy. I also want to say that I am like an academic, and the Budget Lab is an academic exercise, and I am like far from, I'm looking around in the room, and even on this panel, and there are infinitely more sophisticated political minds than I, but like, I kind of understand why the political process lands itself in a place where even if you have a tax plan like the TCJA, which was universally opposed by one party, once you have tax cuts in place on individuals, it becomes hard to say that like, oh, we actually want to increase taxes on this group or that group. Like, I get why politically that is challenging. The thing that I think it's really important and why what the Budget Lab is doing is, I hope, important and of value, is it is useful to try to think, and Clausing Sarin, as Danny was citing to earlier in this discussion, kind of shows you that there are real trade-offs to be had here. And in fact, you can substantially raise the after-tax income of the bottom quintile in a way that makes the tax code much more progressive and do so in a revenue-raising way, but it comes at the cost of raising some taxes on the top quintile. And that's just like a trade-off that we have to face and decide whether we want to make it and decide whether it fits in the political construct that we live in. But I think not grappling with it is a problem, and it's a problem that we're seeking at least to build up the aperture, the infrastructure to help policymakers look at seriously.
So as an academic and as, you know, one of the principals of the Budget Lab, do you think we should look at raising taxes on the top 20%?
I think as we think about the future of our, and as we think about meeting revenue needs going forward, it is going to be important to think about where tax increases can fall. Because like, frankly, all of the stuff.
You're not really answering my question.
I'm
because
not, yeah,
you're very happy
like,
to say, let's raise taxes on Josh's members. But this question I'm trying to get at,
Okay,
what about the other 90%
could
of
we
us?
strike that from?
Yeah.
Josh just fell under the 400. Sorry, man.
Oh, man. Let me say, I know what you're trying to get me to say, and let me say a version of it, which is that both as we think about 2025, but also as we think about our spending needs in the future, and I know Josh and Doug are gonna, and all of us should engage with talking about entitlements at some point in this conversation.
I was going to do that right now.
Oh, good.
Okay.
So we're coming. As we think about talking about the kinds of investments I think we need in children, and the kinds of investments I think we need in the climate, and the kinds of investments that I think we need in the social safety net, looking at 2% or 3% of taxpayers as like the sort of be-all and end-all of the tax debate strikes me as a challenging place to start from. So I like fully acknowledge the premise from an academic exercise. I will also tell you that having this as the sort of central pillar of how we think about where we start seems hugely valuable and important. And also, and we didn't even get to it, if you think about taxes that today are uncollected but are owed, that is 3% of GDP on an annualized basis. It is $700 billion disproportionately from the top, precisely for some of the reasons that Doug was describing to us about the differences between and the ways in which people are able to obfuscate income through certain types of complex pass-through structures that are held by the top. So all I'm saying is there's a lot of revenue to be had from the top and top adjacent type of stuff.
You heard it here first. We're looking at the top adjacent.
So let me just say, this is classic DC, because we love to talk about taxes. But the threshold decision you make is to spend the money. And then you have to finance it somehow. So the threshold decision should be examined a lot more carefully, in my view. And people always talk about growth and go straight to tax policy. The federal budget and its structure is an ongoing headwind to growth. It is an enormous impediment to growing. And I think it's not a coincidence that GDP per capita grew at 2.4% every year in the 20th century, and is now growing at 1.4% in the 21st century, when we keep running up these enormous deficits and debt. Because the bulk of what we do in the federal budget is subsidized consumption. So the budget is just a big machine to take some consumption in the private sector, but mostly saving investment and transforming it into subsidies to consumption. And if a nation does not save and invest and instead consumes, it does not grow. And that's our problem. And so thinking about how we subsidize consumption and how much we subsidize consumption is central to this. And one of the things that the Budget Lab is attempting to do is to identify those outlays which aren't consumption but turn out to be investments, which have payoffs in the future. Those should be preserved, and the subsidies need to be examined much more carefully. And that leads you straight to entitlement reform, because the whole point of Social Security was to have the elderly live better in retirement. That was the point. Subsidize their consumption. Same is true of Medicare. Now we have the trade-off, right? The thing's out of, the budget is out of control. Where are we going to tighten this up? What consumption subsidies are going to be reduced? And that has to be a central part of the discussion, because we cannot let that go and somehow fight over tax policy and think we're going to be okay. We will not be okay.
Josh, and I'm going to preface this by saying, I think one of the more interesting political evolutions in the last few years is the evolution of your party, the Republican Party, on the question of entitlements. The standard bearer of the Republican Party now is dead set against any changes whatsoever to Medicare and Social Security.
Can we drink now?
Soon, Doug.
Soon.
Do you disagree with that? And how did we get here?
No, and I don't know, so I'm reversing my first answer. But I completely agree with where Doug is going on this, and I think it's a huge challenge for our entire country that we have we're a rich country. We're so blessed with so many resources. And yet we face this enormous budget challenge, not because we are spending too much on the environment or education or our kids. We are probably underspending. We are overspending in our old age entitlement programs, and we are doing that in a way that is subsidizing the middle class and the upper middle class, and even the upper class I can say as a Social Security recipient now. We are subsidizing people that don't need it, as Doug said, for more consumption. And yet our politics have now made it impossible for us to address what is the overwhelming issue in our budget situation in a serious way. I worked for President George W. Bush all the way through his 8 years in the White House. He campaigned in 2004 with two new initiatives that he had not really campaigned extensively on in 2000. One was immigration reform, and the other was Social Security reform. And both of them fell short, immigration by only a small amount, sadly, and we're still struggling with that. And that's That's been one of the major impediments to, other impediments to growth in this country over the last 20 years, and will be if we don't fix it for the coming years. And the other was Social Security reform, where we didn't get close. I mean, there was no appetite in the rank and file on Capitol Hill or among the even the broader Republican electorate at that time when it was a Bush Republican Party. There was no appetite for addressing, even in modest ways, the enormous liabilities that entitlements are imposing on our country. I don't know what the answer is, but I know that we will not be a prosperous country for your kids, Natasha, or mine, if we don't succeed in addressing the problem of entitlements, which can be done in a sensible and very humane way.
And can I just say one thing on entitlements, which is also going to be a plug, I think, for the Budget Lab again. I do think that part of the challenge, you both should tell me if this is wrong, is that it's true that the Social Security Trust Fund is like approaching insolvency, but that approaching is in like 2034. And it just feels pretty far out in a world in which we're only now starting to grapple with like the 2025 tax cuts that are set to expire, and like, you know, realistically, like many people in this room will probably put odds on like a deal on December 25th or December 31st of next year, right? So like a deadline is kind of, the lack of deadline that is proximate is kind of challenging.
Yeah.
And what I hope that the Budget Lab is going to be able to contribute on this question and on many others is like, who knows when the political process is going to start to be able to engage with these questions in a deep way. But when they do, we should pre-bake some of their work. So we should give them a bunch of options, and we should show them what their different options are going to do in ways that enable the kind of policymaking and analysis and analytical choices that I think we all find really appealing.
And that's a great segue to my next question, because we only have a few minutes left, and I do want to get to the budget process question, which I think is one of the real areas of value added of this group. Natasha, you've just, one of the papers you've written for the Budget Lab refers to the broken budget process. If I understand it correctly, you're basically saying that the process locks into only thinking about deficits in a way that is biased against progressive priorities. Have I got, like in a second or two, could you just summarize that? And then I want to get Doug and Josh both to reflect on whether they agree or disagree and why.
Yeah, I think that's basically right, and I actually think about it through the lens of some of Josh's members in the following way. I teach corporate finance at Yale, and when I teach my students, I say, like, if you're a CEO who's thinking about building a new factory, you're thinking about, like, what are the costs of building that new factory? And you're also thinking about what is that new factory going to give you? So, like, am I going to be able to launch a new product line, or am I going to be able to broaden or make my production more efficient? When you're thinking about things through the lens, and there are historical reasons, there are budget rules, there's the reconciliation process, there are lots of reasons why we've landed on short-run sort of revenue estimates as the coin of the land as we think about legislative debates. But when you're doing that exercise, you're really only thinking about one half of the ledger. So you're thinking about things like a child tax credit, or like universal pre-K, or like the Inflation Reduction Act's climate provisions as costs, because you're thinking about like money out the door from the government today, but you're not really internalizing what that money is going to bring you in the future in a way that allows you to make the kind of cost-benefit analysis that you would want to do if you were a corporate executive trying to think about building your factory. And I actually think that this is not to the fault of scorekeepers or the scorekeeping process, because that's what they do, what they've been asked to do. They've been asked to produce over the budget window, here are cost estimates. I actually think it's a flaw in the policy process, and it's one we're hoping to correct with our work, because we think that we can like build the infrastructure and the tools to let people do this kind of analytical work themselves, and then come to the conclusions about what the cost and benefits are of particular reforms.
Doug, In her paper, Natasha has a couple of ideas. One is she thinks that we should perhaps look sometimes beyond 10 years to, say, 25 to 50-year budget windows for policy impacts. She would like to see more dynamic analysis, for example.
That always
like,
goes well.
Yeah, like what are the revenue benefits of reducing child poverty via the CTC if that indeed happens? And I think more grappling with some of the non-fiscal outcomes, like on climate and so forth. I think implicitly she's saying maybe the CBO could do this, but maybe somebody else could do this. But as a person who held that seat for quite a few years, what do you think of that?
So first, on budgeting, genuinely, I think we should budget for years 1, 2, and 50. Because the value of the 10th year budget estimate is 0. I mean, the standard error around it's got to be 7,000. I mean,
To take a very precise number.
I mean, but what you want to know is what are we doing? What's the plan that this Congress has to execute on, and are we on track? And we know we're not on track. We look at the year 50, we are wildly off track, and so things need to be fixed. The actual numbers in between don't have a great deal of value. They just tell us we're off track. So I'm not a huge fan of formalizing it into the budget committees and the budget process year 27. That doesn't seem to me value added. The second is there's a big difference between a cost estimate, which is the federal budget cost of something, the economic cost benefit analysis, the social cost benefit analysis, and it is the job of our elected officials to go find out the benefits of programs. And they are informed of the costs in a very systemic and high-quality way by the CBO. There's no paucity of estimates of the benefits of federal programs. There's a whole industry out there in research centers and academic institutions that are trying to inform that, and there's room for more. And there's a great place to have people like the Budget Lab putting the budget and the perceived economic benefits together in one place and let lawmakers make it. I don't understand what's so magical about taking a CBO that's doing its job and risking undercutting its excellence by giving it too many jobs.
Well, paraphrasing.
That does not seem like the right answer to me.
I think I'm going to paraphrase, but I think one of the points Natasha makes in her paper is that even though the CBO is going to have uncertainty and errors like everybody else, it is perceived as a neutral arbiter, and therefore it exercises outsized influence on the direction of debate in this town. And that's why, if I understand you correctly, you would like this type of analysis to come out of a place like that, not just,
I'd like to believe that was true, and I'd like to believe I had something to do with it. But they hide behind the CBO all the time. Don't give me that. No. They just say CBO's great when they don't really want to do it, and they hide. So if they want to do it, they can discard the CBO cost estimate, and they do. They can say the benefits are enormous when they're nil, and they do. The problem is not the CBO in the process. The problem is the problem. Rudy Penner said that 100 years ago. No, probably 70. I don't know. It's still true.
Do you want to?
Oh, I would love to. Well, I want to make sure I don't overstep on Josh, too.
Oh, no, I don't want to get into
It's like I'm not.
Doug is right.
So I think there are a couple of things. One, I think, and I like Doug's 1 to 50 kind of mental model. I think the reality is if you look at, for example, reconciliation as a process, it has requirements built in for what the second decade looks like from a revenue perspective. And so partly we are depending on some of these numbers. And the thing that I find sort of troubling or I find difficult, and again, this is to no fault of, I want to be super explicit, I fully agree with Doug, and I'm not sure whether this work should happen at CBO, this work should happen at the Budget Lab, this work should happen at another government institution that's not CBO. I don't know the answers. But what I'll say is that there is a tendency to, and I found this when I've done a lot of academic work on invest in the IRS and then what happens. And one of the things that happens when you invest in the IRS and have them audit more high-end taxpayers is that the high-end taxpayers look at their neighbors who are getting audited, and they're more likely to adjust their behavior in response to the fact that they're observing more people get audited. And the corporations that are watching, that they have the same tax planners, and they're saying, oh, this corporation got audited for doing that, you're likely to get audited in the same way. There are just like behavioral aspects that matter and that bear on even what in the short run and certainly in the long run, the sort of expectation is from some of the investments that we make in tax administration today in terms of revenue collection in the future. And the thing that I struggle with sometimes is because there's uncertainty embedded in exactly what the right number is. Is the right number for a deterrence or a behavioral effect the 3 that comes from Treasury? Is it the 12 that comes from the new paper by Nathan Hendren and Ben Sprung-Kaiser? Is it somewhere in between? We assume that the right number is like 0 or close to 0. And like that assumption is also a choice. All of these estimates are not like, there's not like some magic in the precision of them. They're all built on a series of assumptions, and the assumptions are hard and difficult and challenging, even in the short run, let alone in the long run. But not grappling with them, and that's part of why I think the Budget Lab is adding value by just showing you. It's like democratizing the budget process. That's how we conceive of ourselves. Just showing you the set of choices that are being made and the set of choices we're making and why we're making them. I think like sunlight is best disinfectant in some sense will add some value to the overall process. But I take Doug's point very deeply. Like I am very sensitive to where exactly this sort of cost-benefit analysis should be happening. And I'm not sure I know the right answer for the set of reasons that Doug laid out, but also, frankly, for capacity constraint reasons. Like, there is a lot of work that CBO and JCT are doing day in and day out to even be able to produce what they produce today. And asking them to do all of the other stuff that we envision would be useful from a policy analysis perspective is really putting them in a totally different space than they've been.
So let me just, in the spirit of this, I mean,
Yeah.
we conducted the first dynamic score under my tenure at CBO, and we invested a lot of time in looking at it in different ways and showing different ways to do the analysis and what answer you got. And I thought, this is great. We're going to teach Congress so much about how they do their business. And their conclusion was that we didn't know what we were doing because it was all over the map. And I thought they'd learned that if you paired 2003 tax cuts with the prescription drug program, they'd cancel each other. They concluded we did it wrong. I mean, that's it. So when you set up the Budget Lab and allow people to learn about this stuff, do not think it's going to be members of Congress. That belongs outside. They're not there to learn. And they're busy people. They have a job, and it's not figuring out the models.
I think we have a few minutes for some questions, and I think we have a microphone back there. If you want to raise your hand, there's a microphone over here, too. Does anybody have a question? What?
Martha has a question.
I can also just try to sing out without the microphone. Oh, great. You know, Doug made a comment about looking at which, for government spending, which areas like pay off and have investments down the road. And I will shout out here CBO's recent paper on Medicaid, which I thought was really interesting and really useful in this space. This is a very economics-focused conversation, but we are all also individuals with utility functions that we are plugging things into. And, there are certain types of spending that people care about as like a thing government should do. And there are things that, I personally think, even if there isn't a payoff 50 years down the line, it's something I'd like to see the government do. I'm sure you all also have things that you think you would like the government to do. No. There's no payoffs. You don't think they should do it? Nothing.
I'm done.
Great. All right, there we go. But I'm just wondering, how you think about, I'm trying to think of the right way to phrase this question, talking about, the preferences within the budget that, we try to have these very high-minded economic conversations, but some of this just comes down to individual policy preferences.
So
Where everything is economic.
yeah, no, I think Among the biggest concerns I have is just the basic mandatory discretionary split in the budget, because discretionary spending, annual appropriations, is where we do basic research, infrastructure, education, national security, all the things our founders saw as the role of the government, and the places where we genuinely invest in the future by conventional standards, and it's getting pushed out of the budget. I just think that's a big problem for us, and we need to fix that. The broader issue of how do we pick among the varieties of investments we might make, or varieties of income support programs we might prefer, that's what representative democracy is about. You elect people, and you settle it that way.
Question here? Oh, sorry.
And there's one there.
Kelly, can we have a microphone up here? And there was another.
There's another one back.
Okay, that
Hi.
was
Thank you all. Indy Dattagupta, Center for Law and Social Policy. Nice to see some friends. One of the things that I think is hard for people to focus on when you have a policy, say, for example, like the child tax credit expansion that you helpfully model, is the effects on spending on other adjacent policies. I like the adjacent term. So we're going to go with adjacent policies, right? So Danny showed, for example, effects on earnings later in life, right? And then you could recoup some of the costs through taxes. You could recoup some of the costs through reduced SNAP, food stamp spending, Medicaid, so on and so forth, right? Is that something that is possible to show, nodding and looking at, should I hand it back to Martha?
I'm looking at Danny,
Danny?
because
Okay.
he should take this. But the answer is yes, and it's something that we're pretty interested in trying to do. And especially when there's an academic base that we can rely on to like justify those estimates.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, particularly if you're looking at the CTC or any kind of investments in children, there are all those ways that those pay off later, right? And some of it is in very direct government spending, like literally mechanically, you no longer qualify for this program because you are a higher earner. Some of it is in more indirect effects, right? So if you're less likely to get sick, that's great for Medicare, things like that. And so I'm going to cop out and kind of say, stay tuned. But I think you've also, again, from CBO and their Medicaid, you've seen these kinds of interests in those longer run things.
Let me give you an example, just sort of how this plays out. When we did the prescription drug program in 2003, everyone said, if people take the drugs, they're not going to need other medical treatments, other therapies, and so you ought to offset that with reduced Medicare spending elsewhere. And with, that was a very compelling argument. And so the question is, how big is that? There was absolutely no research that would guide how big it was. And so we provided no offset, and everyone was angry. Over time, that research was developed. People did a lot of research on it, and that's now a regular part of CBO scoring of those kinds of things. The same can be true for a lot of these policies. It just takes a lot of research to get the magnitudes correct and to hone the offsets.
I think there was a question back here.
Hi, Leah Sargent from the Niskanen Center. I'd love to hear a little more about how you're approaching modeling the administrative burden of the tax code, particularly because it seems like there are two ways to address that. I'd love to hear how you're thinking about modeling both. One is just simplifying it so that when I file my taxes, it's less onerous for me to do. And the other is in-housing what's essentially unpaid work that's put on the taxpayer.
Totally.
So that there's more staffing for helplines or assistance, et cetera. So how are you approaching those two wings of administrative burden
This
reduction?
is like my favorite question. It's almost like I planted you to ask this. And both are super duper important. And part of what Danny started, and what's great, and I want to shout out to the team here, and this is really Rich and John, who have developed the infrastructure for us to be able to comment on this. Like, what we can show you already is two things that are really interesting. One is, as Danny was describing, if you simplify the code along the lines of like keeping the standard deduction high and also getting rid of the pass-through deduction, you're gonna see that overall in aggregate, Americans are spending over $200 million fewer hours on tax filing than they would be otherwise. That is great news. But the thing that I think is almost cooler is that based on the research that Rich and John have done, the IRS today has enough information through information returns to be able to pre-fill tax returns for almost 40% of Americans. That brings us closer to being like Sweden and the Nordic countries, where you fulfill your tax obligations not by spending hours on tax prep, not by spending hundreds of dollars, but by saying yes to a text message. And like, I don't want to overstate the simplicity of doing this, especially as someone who spent a lot of time with the IRS. They are running on 1950s technological infrastructure. The timing of those information returns is not aligned today such that it would be super easy for them to do this. But like, that is the future, and it's a future that we can build towards, and we can kind of show you what the benefits are going to be for people if we're able to make these investments that I think are so first order, and that I'm worried that some members of Congress might be seeking to roll back.
I just want to jump in super quickly and note that the original idea for the burden came from Sophia, so shout out to her. And two, the methodology of how we do it that Rich developed is on our website, so please take a look and then yell at Rich.
Yeah.
I think Mark had a question. Okay, yeah.
Stand up, you said? Okay, you can hear me better if I stand? So I appreciate that you all, I think, have not just have budget estimates, but also distributional, economic, other things like that. Have you thought about, or are you going to think about how they intertwine, in particular, like what's the distributional effect of lower compliance costs, and especially how do you think about financing and the distributional effect of that? Because obviously, you know, I can cut poverty a lot if I spend $20 trillion than if I'm trying to save $20 trillion.
Yeah. And so I don't want to, and Martha and Danny should jump in, and Josh and Doug should tell us the ways in which this makes sense or doesn't make sense. But like, I think we are very interested in the interactions of the various types of effects that we are quantifying and focused on. And particularly something that I said it towards the beginning of the panel, but I'll say it again, like, I personally have been long interested in, from like academic lens, but I'm super interested in thinking about how the Budget Lab can speak to this question about the burden of deficits on future generations, and like who bears distributionally the cost of running high and growing deficits. And I think it's a question that's like ultimately really hard to answer, and like hard to answer well for some of the reason that Doug was describing about like the knowledge base just doesn't exist today to be able to comment in the way that we would like to with the empirical and academic precision that we would like to on the question. And so part of what the Budget Lab is interested in doing is not just serving as a translation mechanism between the existing academic evidence and some of these questions of policy import, but actually prodding academics to have discussions and to develop the capacity to model exactly what some of what Mark is describing.
One more, I think, right?
I have a mic, okay. I'm Max Gennis from Policy Engine. We build an open source software platform for budget analysis. So I just wanted to, first of all, appreciate the immense amount of awesome interactives on the site, and also the fact that it's all open source, or the code is. I think just that's an awesome way to promote the science. And given the community of scientists in the room and beyond, I'm kind of curious how you view the development and advancement of the science that we can all sort of collaborate on together. Are there things you're looking for external institutions to do, hoping things that you hope other institutions adopt from your methodologies, et cetera?
I think what we are, so that's Max, I've gotten to talk to you about this some, so I'll sort of say this here, and I'm super keen to talk more with you and more with the people in this room about exactly this. Like, I think part of why we are so committed to like open source and making available all of our code and kind of not being a black box with respect to how we're deriving some of these estimates goes to something that Doug said earlier in this conversation, which is about like confidence intervals being wide and like the inherent like uncertainty about a lot of the assumptions that underlie even something that seems like relatively easy, like what's the 10-year estimate attached to X rate change on the individual level or on the corporate level. And I think what we're hoping to do is like tell you our best guess based on our reading of the literature, but have external voices. I've already heard some today say like, we don't agree with you on X, Y, and Z for these reasons. And that can both help shape our thinking, but also help people make their own choices with our tools that allows them to derive their own estimates of what they think particular policy reforms are going to deliver. And as we look on the horizon to TCJA and the expiration of, though I should stop calling it, as I was saying, Doug wants it to be a broader conversation, and I agree with that. As we look on the horizon of a major tax reform moment, I think that more of us being in dialogue, not just with each other, but also being in dialogue with like the broader policy apparatus, and maybe it's not members of Congress, but maybe it's congressional staffers, about what some of these options look like and what their interactions are and what their long-term consequences might be. Like, that's the discussion that I'm keen for all of us to be having, and I think there is real value in doing it, and frankly, I think there is real value in trying to start it as far in advance of a legislative moment as we can.
Well, we're sort of at the end of our time. Thank you to the panelists. I want to just sort of a final thought here is that I think those of us who've been in the fiscal trenches for a long time start to use a kind of a code with each other. We always know what we mean when we say, what did the CBO say, or the JCT, or the TPC, the Tax Policy Center, or the CRFB, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. I hope and I believe that in a few years from now, we'll be saying, what did YBL, the Yale Budget Lab, say about this? So good luck, and thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate it. One, we joke, but also please do send us feedback on the things that we've been working on. As Natasha said, there's a lot of assumptions inherent in budget scoring, and we really love to discuss those. I would also not be me if I did not at this moment ask you to follow the _budget_lab on Twitter and also on LinkedIn. And I will conclude by saying that across the hall we have food, drinks, and hats. So we hope, of course, that you all will be able to stay around for all of those. Thank you.